Chapter 15, Section 4, The Overthrow of Reconstruction. What were the main factors in both the North and the South for the abandonment of Reconstruction? Why did Reconstruction end? The South's traditional leadership, planters, merchants, and Democratic politicians condemned, hated the new governments as corrupt and inefficient examples of black supremacy. But corruption, which existed in Reconstruction governments, was confined to no single race, region, or party. Those governments were not corrupt because there were African Americans in it. They were corrupt because they were politicians, no matter the color. The rapid growth of state budgets allowed many to enrich themselves at public expense. But corruption was greatest elsewhere, in the whiskey ring involving the Grant administration, officials, and New York's infamous Tweed ring controlled by Democrats. Rising taxes needed for schools and railroad development also sparked opposition to Reconstruction, including among poor whites who had initially supported the Republicans but bolted to the Democrats when their economic situation did not improve. Southern whites opposed Reconstruction primarily because they could not accept that blacks should vote, hold political office, or enjoy legal equality. They thought Reconstruction should be overthrown in order for white supremacy to return and planters to have a disciplined and dependable workforce. A reign of terror. Violence was endemic in the Reconstruction era South. At first, it was local and unorganized, with blacks being assaulted and murdered for refusing to make way for whites on sidewalks or trying to purchase land. But the establishment of Republican state governments after 1867 ignited organized campaigns of violence against supporters of radical Reconstruction. Secret societies, most notably the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK, tried to prevent blacks from voting and tried to destroy the Republican Party by assassinating local leaders and public officials. The KKK, a terrorist organization started in 1866 in Tennessee that soon spread throughout the South, functioned as a military arm of the Democratic Party in that region. In many counties, it started a reign of terror against black and white Republican leaders. But blacks were especially targeted, particularly blacks who held office or exercised political rights. The new Southern governments could not suppress the KKK, and in 1870 and 71, Congress adopted enforcement acts that outlawed terrorist groups, allowed the president to use the army against them, and defined acts that deprived citizens of civil and political rights as federal crimes. President Grant dispatched federal marshals and troops to suppress the KKK, and by 1872, most areas of the South were peaceful. So the KKK was developed to turn back the tide of all this progress that had been made during Reconstruction. The federal government, the president, actually stepped in to try to help alleviate the situation. And so by 1872, the KKK had not completely disappeared, but things were much safer in the South. And here's a political cartoon by Thomas Nast called The Union as It Was, the Lost Cause Worse Than Slavery. And it shows the KKK kind of shaking hands with the White League over a trembling African American family. Their schoolhouse is being burnt down. Someone has been lynched here from a tree. It really was terrifying for African Americans at the time. And the reality is, unfortunately, the way society is today, African Americans, especially young men, unfortunately, still have things to fear. The liberal Republicans. Northern commitment to Reconstruction declined in the 1870s. Radicals such as Thaddeus Stevens passed away or otherwise left politics, and they were replaced by figures less dedicated to equal rights for blacks. Northerners more and more felt the South should solve its own problems without continuous federal involvement. Many in the North believed that now that the national government had freed the slaves and made them citizens and given them the vote, blacks had to depend on themselves. In 1872, an influential group of Republicans, angered by corruption in the Grant administration and believing that federal power needed to be reduced, formed their own party, calling themselves the Liberal Republicans. They nominated Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, for president. They repeated Democratic criticisms of radical Reconstruction as encouraging corruption and preventing the rule of the best men in the South, that region's natural leaders. Democratic leaders embraced the Republican split and endorsed Greeley, but many rank-and-file Democrats could not stomach Greeley, a former Whig and Republican, and Grant won a second term to the presidency by a great margin. Nonetheless, liberal Republicans and Democrats in the North could now agree on rolling back Reconstruction. Now, fortunately, that was going to leave African Americans without protection of the federal government. The North's retreat. Northern critics stepped up their often openly racist attacks on Southern governments as dens of corruption and misgovernment ruined by a black rule. A severe depression beginning in 1873 also distracted Northern Republicans from Southern issues. Democrats were widely successful in the 1874 elections and took control of the House of Representatives, but before this new Congress met, legislators passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which barred racial discrimination in public accommodations, such as hotels and theaters. The Supreme Court also signaled a retreat from Reconstruction in the slaughterhouse cases of 1873, in which it held that the federal government could not effectively protect the legal and civil rights of individuals in the states, effectively mitigating the 14th Amendment. The triumph of the Redeemers. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction was under serious assault. Democrats regained control of states with large white voting majorities, such as Tennessee, North Carolina, and Texas, and called themselves the Redeemers for having redeemed the white South from corruption, misgovernment, and Northern and black control. Violence flared in states where Reconstruction governments persisted, and the Grant administration now refrained from protecting besieged governments and Republicans. In 1875 and in 1876, armed Democrats on Election Day simply destroyed ballots and drove blacks away from the polls, capturing states such as Mississippi and South Carolina. So again, with the retreat of the North and the retreat of the federal government from the South, Southern whites took control of politics again. They threatened African Americans to not voting. They were able to get their people back in power in the South. The disputed election and bargain of 1877. Events in South Carolina directly shaped the outcome of the 1876 presidential elections. Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who ran against the Democrats Samuel J. Tilden, New York's governor. By 1876, only South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana were still controlled by Republicans, and the election was so close that whoever carried these states which both parties claimed to have won would become president. Congress tried to resolve this impasse by appointing an electoral commission, which, with a Republican majority, decided that Hayes had carried the critical southern states and had been elected. To secure this result, behind the scenes, Republicans negotiated with the Democrats, agreeing to recognize Democratic control of the South and refrain from future federal interference in Southern affairs. Democrats promised to respect blacks' rights and not dispute Hayes' right to office. This became known as the Bargain of 1877. Hayes quickly ordered federal troops to stand down, which allowed Democrats in Louisiana and South Carolina to occupy the state and government offices. So here's what happens. The election was so close that a deal was made in a hotel behind the scenes in a very shady way. The Democrats told the Republicans, look, the vote is close. We'll go ahead and elect your guy. We'll push our votes to your guy, to Rutherford B. Hayes, but only on the condition that you get Hayes to end Reconstruction. He pulls the troops out of the South, and he promises not to interfere again. And the deal is made. So it is this bargain of 1877, which is the moment in which the federal government abandons the African Americans of the South. Okay, all in order to keep control. Okay, because their office and their control is more important than the people they serve. Things don't look much different from our politics today. And so that is how Rutherford B. Hayes was elected in 1877. Here's the electoral map so you can see how close it actually was. The popular vote, Tilden, the Democrat, won. But look at the electoral vote. They were both at 50% by one vote because 3 states were disputed. And Congress made that decision and sent those votes to Rutherford B. Hayes. And the rest is history. The end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, defined as America's adjustment to the end of slavery, continued long after 1877. Blacks still voted and in some states held office well into the 1890s. But a distinct period in which Republicans controlled much of the South, blacks held some political power, and the federal government protected the basic rights of all Americans. And it came to an end in 1877. It would take a whole other century, a whole 100 years, until the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, in which the federal government would finally act again to secure the rights of all, regardless of their race. So it's almost like we take one step forward, but we wind up taking 2 steps back in this country sometimes. Okay? The last thing I want to cover very quickly, you notice there's a political cartoon by Thomas Nast again. I've shown you quite a few political cartoons by Thomas Nast. He was a quite popular and important cartoonist and played a huge role in our history. He's known as the father of the American cartoon. He critiqued slavery, crime, politicians, everything. He was born in Germany in 1840, and his family moved to New York City around the time he was 6 years old, so he was an immigrant. He did poorly in school. He preferred to draw and to do art. He eventually dropped out. In 1855, he landed his first illustration job, and several years later, he joined the staff of Harper's Weekly. There is where he made a name for himself as a political cartoonist, focusing on topics like the Civil War, slavery, and corruption. He would also become known as the modern representation of Santa Claus. He's the one who drew Santa Claus the way we know him today, as this kind of jolly, chubby man who lived in the North Pole. And in 1886, Thomas Nast left Harper's Weekly and fell into hard times. In 1902, he was appointed general counsel to Ecuador, and then while in that country, he contracted yellow fever and died in December of 1902. Of course, he is the gentleman who created the symbols for the Democratic and Republican Party, the donkey and the elephant, and again is widely known for a lot of the great political cartoons of the 19th century. Okay, and with that ends chapter 15. If you have any questions regarding the overthrow of Reconstruction, please feel free to reach out to me. Thanks.